Thank you. So, as you just heard, I study what's sometimes called political fact-checking. This is what outfits like PolitiFact and factcheck.org do, along with most other major news organizations these days. It's been, I think, impossible to miss during this election cycle. And it's so ubiquitous that I think it's easy to forget that this style of reporting is only about a decade old. This is not something that journalists were doing throughout the 20th century. So I'm going to talk today a bit about sort of where political fact-checking comes from, about its history, and then along the way try to take up the puzzle of why fact-checking doesn't always yield the results that we might hope for in terms of cleaning up public discourse. From the outset, though, I think it's very important to distinguish this new style of political fact-checking from the traditional sort, which has long been practiced in newspapers and magazines. And the best way to do that, I have found, is with this example. So this is a picture of our handsome president when he had just graduated from Harvard Law School. This is from a booklet which was prepared by his literary agent. He hadn't yet published a book, but he was up and coming. He had an agent. They put together this booklet. And I wonder if anybody can spot the fairly grave mistake that appears in the first couple of sentences. Indeed, he was not born in Kenya, as this pamphlet indicates. This was a mistake. The person who put together this pamphlet said decades later, when it became a public controversy, that this was nothing more than a fact-checking error. There was never any information given to us by Obama suggesting that he was born in Kenya and not Hawaii. So I like that example because it captures the sort of essential impulse behind traditional fact-checking, which is as old, I think, as the printing press, which is the need to try to get as many of the details right, the typos gone, before running off, 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or 1,000,000 copies of your Gutenberg Bible or your newspaper, your magazine, your political tract, whatever it is. Fact-checking appears as a job description in professional journalism beginning in the 1920s and 1930s, sort of at the beginning of the heyday of national magazines in the United States, which developed in this period kind of these dedicated research and fact-checking departments, which were separate from the copy editing and the other editorial departments. Time magazine was the first to do this in the 1920s. It's interesting that this was one of the sort of early entry points for women into journalism. At that time, there were not very many women at all employed as reporters, but this was seen as perfectly suitable work for a young lady to do, presumably before she went off and found a mate and got married. So even into the 1950s and 60s, you find lots of ads for fact checkers in the women's section of the classifieds. Many magazines have cut or eliminated their fact-checking departments, but the New Yorker famously still has very rigorous fact-checking. They've got a staff of 16 people. Again, this is separate from the copy editing department. And they spend weeks poring over all of the factual details in the articles they run. So that's traditional fact-checking. But over the last decade, maybe the last 15 years, we've seen the emergence of a new style of fact-checking, which is not about catching mistakes before they become public, but rather about correcting misinformation once it's already out there in the public sphere. And as I say, this is a relatively new thing in journalism, and I think it's worthwhile to begin with another example that really captures sort of what this can look like. This also has to do with our president's birthplace.
Donald, you and I have known each other for a long time, and I don't understand why you're doubling down on this birther issue after the state of Hawaii formally says this is the legitimate birth certificate. He was born in Hawaii. Why are you going through all of this, Donald?
Well, a lot of people don't agree with that birth certificate.
But if the state of Hawaii authorizes it, if the state of Hawaii says this is official, he was born in Hawaii on this date, here it is, why do you deny that?
A lot of people do not think it was an authentic certificate.
How can you say that if
you won't report it, Wolf, but many people do not think it was authentic. His mother was not in the hospital. There were many other things that came out. And frankly, if you would report it accurately, I think you'd probably get better ratings than you're getting, which are pretty small.
Donald.
So I like this example a lot because it captures a couple of important facets of this style of reporting. One is how entertaining it can be, right? There's something inherently appealing about this kind of built-in conflict, the drama of exposing somebody's deceptions. And as we'll see, this has been a very popular style of political reporting. But this example also captures how awkward it can be for the journalist, right? Who has to abandon, to some extent, their role as a dispassionate, nonpartisan observer and take on the function, at least a little bit, of a kind of prosecutor, right? To make arguments, to draw conclusions. And that's something that's very uncomfortable for professional journalists. So what Wolf Blitzer didn't say there was that most of the research about President Obama's birthplace had been done by other groups long before CNN finally fact-checked this question during the 2012 cycle. It had been done mainly by this new class of dedicated fact-checking organization. These are the groups that I've mainly studied in my research. There's factcheck.org, which was established in 2003. It's based at the University of Pennsylvania. And then also PolitiFact and the Washington Post's fact-checker. And so these are full-time outlets that do nothing but that style of political fact-checking. And they've really kind of led this wave of fact-checking in the United States and increasingly in the world. It's interesting that political fact-checking is spreading globally. It's on every continent. This map includes data that's just a month old from a database maintained by the Duke Reporters Lab. And they count 113 active fact-checking sites around the world today. Interestingly, more than 90% of those launched in just the last 5 years. So this is something new that's also spreading very quickly around the world. So where does fact-checking come from? As I've said, groups like PolitiFact and factcheck.org are sort of a new force in American journalism. But fact-checking does have this prehistory in US reporting that's worth reviewing quickly because it really captures how awkward and how difficult this can be for professional reporters. The earliest examples I've been able to find of this kind of fact-checking by professional news organizations are in the 1980s when there was sort of a small spate of fact-checking inspired by our 40th president. People forget this now, but the Teflon president came into office with a really well-established reputation for errors and exaggerations. He constantly mangled the details of the various government programs that he was going to eliminate. And so the Washington Post got in the habit of running these fact-checking sidebars. So what you see here it's actually the full transcript of a press release of a press conference that Reagan gave in 1982, carried in the Post. And then the next day, they ran this follow-up article going over all of the mistakes that he had made and calling this a familiar pattern. Another even better example, I think, comes in 1984. What you see on the left is the continuation of a front-page article reporting on a major policy speech that Reagan had given, which was kind of praising the progress that the white regime in South Africa had supposedly made in dismantling apartheid. And then Next to the article, you see this fact-checking box. They would sometimes call these truth boxes, pointing out all of the errors that he had made in describing, this supposed progress in South Africa. What's interesting is that the Washington Post didn't do this for very long in the 1980s. They gave it up after readers began to complain. Readers thought that the reporters were being too tough on Ronald Reagan. As Walter Pincus, who was an important editor at the Post, remembered in an interview decades later, after they began getting these complaints, the paper stopped doing it. And as he said, we stopped truth squatting every press conference. We left it then to the Democrats. And of course, that's been the default practice of objectivity in American journalism, right? Reporters customarily report both sides and then leave it up to the reader or the viewer to sort of figure out where the truth is. So another major turning point came in the 1988 contest between George H.W. Bush and Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. This campaign, this race, was so dominated by negative and deceptive TV advertising that it provoked kind of a backlash among journalists. So this is one of the most famous advertisements in the history of American political commercials. It was aired by the Bush campaign just a couple of weeks before Election Day. And some analysts have credited it with really turning the tide in Bush's favor, although I don't think there's any way to show that decisively. I'll play just a couple seconds of it.
Michael Dukakis has opposed virtually every defense system we developed. He opposed new aircraft carriers. He opposed anti-satellite weapons. He opposed 4 missile systems, including the Pershing II missile deployment. Dukakis opposed the...
So, you get the idea. It's hard to say what was more damaging, right? That goofy picture of Dukakis wearing this funny helmet, or this list of demonstrably false claims that the Bush campaign aired about Dukakis's supposed opposition to all of these programs. Almost every one of those claims was false, and so the Dukakis campaign objected really strenuously. There was a little bit of a furor. And a few days later, the Washington Post, again, ran this article analyzing that ad and debunking all of its false claims, along with another commercial by the Dukakis campaign. And actually, that Washington Post piece was inspired by this ABC report that aired just a couple of days after the ad first dropped, which I really like because I think it's the first example of a video fact check, a format that's become much more common since then. So I'll play a bit of that.
Michael Dukakis has opposed virtually every defense system we developed.
In fact, he supports a range of new weapons, including the Trident II missile.
He opposed anti-satellite weapons.
In fact, Dukakis would ban those weapons only if the Soviets did the same principle incorporated in the INF Treaty, which George Bush supports.
He opposed 4 missile systems, including the Pershing II missile deployment.
In fact, Dukakis opposes not 4 missile systems, but 2 as expensive and impractical, and never opposed deploying Pershing II.
Dukakis opposed the stealth bomber.
In fact, Dukakis has supported the stealth bomber. While this commercial is an especially glaring example of how to fiddle with your opponent's record for your own benefit, it's only fair to note that Democrats haven't been above doing it to George Bush.
In fact, in 1985, George Bush personally cast the tie-breaking Senate vote to cut Social Security benefits.
Nope, not to cut, but to freeze benefits.
So these are called ad watch pieces, and they became quite popular during the 1990s. They were, aired by both local and national TV stations increasingly over the course of the decade, and also appeared in newspapers. Then they started to tail off towards the end of the decade. But what's interesting is to notice how the producer kind of sandwiched this Dukakis fact check into this larger piece. And actually, 4 years after the race, the person who'd put together that piece complained about that. saying that he was unable to convince the higher-ups at ABC News that sometimes there's only one side of a story, right? They really wanted to see this balanced fact check, and that's been a kind of recurring criticism of these sorts of ad watch pieces. So as I said, those ad watch pieces sort of tailed off in the late 90s. They've resurged, they've increased a bit since then. But beginning in the early 2000s, you see an entirely new style of fact-checking emerge that takes advantage of the internet. And in the to cover the 2004 election, we see something entirely new, which is a full-time fact-checking organization staffed entirely by professional journalists who now specialize in the genre, right? And can develop, procedures, guidelines, their own rule books, and really start to professionalize it and formalize their approach to fact-checking. And this really precipitated a wave of fact-checking by both independent groups and by established news organizations. What's interesting, though, is that even for these full-time fact-checkers, this remains an awkward endeavor. So this odd document you see here is the training manual that PolitiFact hands out to new fact-checkers. I got to pore over this when I was sort of embedded with them. They have a lot of jokes on the front about how you can get a lifetime of enjoyment from your truthometer as long as you don't plug it in during a rainstorm. But on the very first page, they point out that this is a gutsy form of reporting that'll feel a little bit awkward at first. After being trained for years not to take sides, you'll now have to choose which side is right. Right? So that's a difficult thing to do for professionally trained journalists. So that brings us finally to the current election and to the question of what effect, if any, all of this fact-checking has on public discourse. Fact-checking is now deeply entrenched in American journalism. We've seen an extraordinary commitment to the genre in 2016 throughout this election cycle. It seems like every news outlet in this race has now developed its own specialized meter for rating political claims in the style of PolitiFact's Truthometer. So what you see here is CNN fact-checking one of the primary debates with its new 6-point scale. And here we have the big three broadcast networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS. NBC calls its operation the Truth Squad. And meanwhile, ABC, for this election, unveiled the new color-coded 5-point scale. Here they're debunking Trump's claim that he never said that global warming is a Chinese hoax. It turns out that a lot of fact checks of Trump consist in establishing that he did say, often just a day or two before, something that he now says he didn't say. So that's pretty straightforward. And lest you think this is just a phenomenon of the liberal media, Fox News has been a very aggressive fact checker throughout this election, both during the primaries and the presidential race. So here's just quickly a fact check that they aired after the first presidential debate this year.
You want to approve Trans-Pacific Partnership. You were totally in favor of it.
That is just not accurate.
You called it the gold standard.
You called it the gold standard. True or false?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And what's interesting, this has been a problem for Mrs. Clinton for a while, is that she was for it. Dozens of times she articulated in public that she was for it, and she's been called on that she was flip-flop.
So the only reason I like that is because of this old school, stamp logo that they deploy. In that case, they find Trump's claim true. They're essentially, fact-checking Hillary Clinton more in that bit. But they have also debunked, many times claims by Donald Trump. So the New York Times also unveiled a rating system this year for the first time ever. They've done fact-checking in the past, but this is the The first time they went so far as to start rating claims. Depending on the degree of truth, claims are marked either red, yellow, or green. If you click on any one of these sort of capsule fact checks, it'll open up and you'll see a couple of paragraphs explaining how the reporters arrived at their conclusion. Now, they collect all of their fact checks from the entire, all the primaries and the election on a dedicated page. There are now hundreds of them. But they also embed these little boxes into straight news stories when they're relevant. That's something else that they've never done before, which is pretty interesting. And lastly, NPR has done something fairly extraordinary to fact check the latest debates. They use an automated transcription service that supplies the transcript very nearly in real time. And then a team of something like 20 journalists annotates it with fact checks and with additional analysis. So this is the annotated transcript of the first debate. It goes on for pages and pages and pages. By the time it was over, they'd added 74 different annotations to this document. And this was incredibly popular. It was viewed by 6 million people in the couple of days following that debate. And it turns out that fact-checking is consistently quite popular. Sites like PolitiFact and factcheck.org during elections sometimes rack up traffic figures, in the millions, which is kind of incredible for small, policy-oriented, wonky outlets that aren't providing general news. This isn't CBS, they're not the New York Times. They're just a fact-checking site, and they'll get millions of visits a day at the peak of the election cycle. And what you see here is a survey that NPR ran late last year, asking people what kind of coverage they wanted to see, and fact-checking was the second most popular response. This is something we see consistently. So what effect does all of this have? Well, you can be forgiven, obviously, for thinking that this has been an unusually substance-free election, even by the standards of American politics. Despite nearly ubiquitous fact-checking, we've seen widespread, sort of agonizing about whether or not we're in a so-called post-fact or post-truth era, especially in the wake of Trump's candidacy and of the Brexit vote in the UK. And it has seemed sort of extraordinarily difficult to reach consensus on even basic factual claims, right, throughout this race. So I'd like to show sort of a revealing example of that we can then sort of dissect. This concerns a seemingly straightforward fact check of a claim that the First Lady made, a striking claim she made at the climax of her speech at the Democratic National Convention last summer.
So that today, I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. And I watch my daughters, two beautiful, intelligent black young women, playing with their dogs on the White House lawn.
So after the speech, her claim that the White House had been built by slaves got a lot of attention. I wonder if people know or think that that's true or not. Is it in fact true that the White House was built by slaves? See heads nodding yes. Indeed, it is true, right? PolitiFact decided to investigate this after the speech, along with many other news outlets. And they found that indeed slaves had been involved in the construction of the White House beginning in 1792. There's actually a page dedicated to this question at the White House Historical Association, where you can find documents like this one listing some of the payments that had been made to slave owners. As PolitiFact explained, there were slaves as well as free blacks and whites involved in the construction of the White House, but slaves were significantly involved, So we have no quarrel with the way that Obama worded her claim. Now, that seems like a fairly straightforward analysis, but PolitiFact got lots of complaints about this verdict, and so they gathered some of these together in an editor's note. And it's interesting to review, I think, some of the objections that people raised. So one objection was that, as PolitiFact had acknowledged, not only slaves were involved in the construction, and relatedly, that these slaves supposedly were not treated all that harshly, right? That PolitiFact was creating a misleading impression by using the word slaves, which would conjure up images of whipping and all sorts of, unpleasantness. Bill O'Reilly explained, he said, Michelle Obama's claim was accurate, but he went on to explain that the slaves were very well treated, they were well fed, and had decent lodgings provided by the government. One historian that PolitiFact interviewed said, well, we don't know whether that's true or to what extent it's true, but in any event, this was backbreaking labor, and these were slaves, right? They were the property of a slave owner. Other people objected that some of the slaves may have been paid. Again, the historical record is not clear about this. It may be the case that slaves who worked on their days off got to keep those wages instead of seeing them go to their slave owner. But again, you could argue that they're still slaves. The most interesting objection, though, I think, and one I really appreciate a lot, was that the White House has been rebuilt since it was originally erected. So as one person complained, this is a false statement. The White House was fully reconstructed from 1814 to 1817, and then again from 1947 to 1952. Every single stone has been moved and put there again by paid workers, right? In other words, it's not the same house, right? That's this argument. And that's technically true by a very narrow and precise standard, and yet it seems like a very long way to go to counter the broader point that Michelle Obama was making, I think, at least. So that brings us to the question that we started out with of why it is so hard to agree about even basic facts. And I think, broadly speaking, there are two sort of sets of reasons. The first of which is really pretty well understood, and the second of which is sort of not often enough acknowledged. So the first reason is that we, all of us, or none of us, I should say, are not as rational as we usually like to imagine that we are, especially when it comes to deeply held beliefs and political convictions. Human beings are excellent at resolving what's called cognitive dissonance by rationalizing away information that threatens their core identity, their attitudes, their beliefs, etc. The classic study about this, which probably a lot of you are familiar with, comes from the 1950s, the mid-1950s, when a psychologist named Leon Festinger and his colleagues penetrated a UFO cult in the Chicago suburbs. The leader of that cult, Festinger gave her the pseudonym Dorothy Martin. The leader of that cult had been receiving messages from space via automatic writing. That means that the messages were transmitted directly through her and came out in her pen. And these messages warned of an impending apocalypse on December 21st, 1954, that would see North America and Europe, and I think every continent, overrun by floods. But a UFO would come and save this small group. They were called the Seekers. The Seekers even issued a couple of press releases to this effect, so they earned some coverage in some local papers. So Festinger wanted to know what would happen when this apocalypse failed to arrive, hence the title of his book, When Prophecy Fails. And what happened was that after a long and very fretful and stressful night, the Seekers received a new message from space, alerting them that the apocalypse had been averted thanks to their efforts. So as Festinger wrote, the little group, by sitting all night long, had spread so much light that God had saved the world from destruction. Fascinatingly, he observed that after this disappointment, rather than being sort of chastened or toning down their rhetoric, the cult was even more zealous in its prophesying. So the point is that our reason is driven, at least in part, by our beliefs, right? By our affective commitments. This is what psychologists call motivated reasoning. Countless studies demonstrate this phenomenon, but I like this illustration from a survey that the Washington Post ran after gas prices spiked, first under President Bush, and then 6 years later under President Obama. So the Post polled the public about whether they thought that there was anything more that the president could be doing to keep down gas prices. In effect, I think, asking them, to what extent they blame the president for high gas prices. And it turns out that in 2006, 3/4 of Democrats blamed President Bush, but less than half of Republicans did, right? Bush was already quite unpopular, by the way, in 2006. 6 years later, in 2012, under President Obama, those ratios were basically flipped. So now only 1/3 of presidents, only 1/3 of Democrats blame the president, but suddenly 2/3 of Republicans thought that there was something else the president could be doing. We see the same thing in studies that investigate specifically how people respond to fact checks. So there's any number of studies that show how difficult it is to convince people by showing them evidence that their deeply held beliefs are mistaken. So, for instance, large numbers of Americans continue to believe that weapons of mass destruction had been found in Iraq, even after a number of investigations showed that they hadn't, even after the White House publicly acknowledged that they hadn't been found, which happened in 2004. So a number of studies have used this to investigate the effects of corrective information. The complicated chart you see on the top right tested whether a correction could reduce this, levels of misinformation among people who were shown the correction. And it turned out that it was effective for liberals, but not for conservatives, not very effective at all for conservatives. In fact, in some cases for conservatives, you found the belief being more tightly clung to, I don't know how that expression popped in my head, more tightly clung to after they'd been shown the corrective information. Now, it's vital to stress that, of course, this is not only true for conservatives, right? Liberals, progressives are just as resistant to information that cuts against their beliefs. We see this, for instance, in the mythical link between childhood vaccines and autism. One fascinating insight from all the research that's been done into this is that rather than making us more resistant to false beliefs, higher levels of education and information actually sometimes correspond to greater belief in these false claims, because informed people have the cognitive resources to resist the information that contradicts their beliefs. So that's one sort of set of problems with fact checking. But the second reason I think that it's not as effective as we might hope is that fact checkers deal with unusually slippery kinds of facts, right? They deal with things that have to do with social and political life, with what's sometimes called social reality, things that don't exist independently of us as observers, right? If we go back to the example of the White House, what makes this particular pile of bricks the White House? Well, of course, it's our agreement, right? It's our consensus that this is the White House. There's a philosopher, John Searle, who's written a lot about social reality and about these kinds of facts that which he calls institutional facts. So as he writes, There are things that exist only because we believe them to exist. I'm thinking of things like money, property, governments, and marriages. Yet many facts regarding these things are objective facts in the sense that they are not a matter of your or my preferences, evaluations, or moral attitudes. So Searle distinguishes these institutional facts from what he calls the brute facts of nature. For instance, the fact that there's snow on the side of Mount Everest, as he writes. So here's a picture that I found of the internet of two interestingly dressed people standing in front of what the site said is Mount Everest. So according to Searle's scheme, it's a brute fact that there are two bipedal organisms standing near a tall, snowy mountain, but it's an institutional fact that a wedding is taking place, right? Which is actually what's happening in this picture, at least according to the internet. As Searle explains, institutional facts are so called because they require human institutions for their existence. In order that this piece of paper should be a $5 bill, for example, there has to be the human institution of money. Now, in Searle's scheme, these institutional facts are quite solid and certain things, right? They're derived from constitutive rules. They're not a matter of opinion or of interpretation, as he explains. They're ontologically subjective, but epistemically objective. One of his favorite examples is borders, right? Borders aren't supposed to be matters of interpretation. They're a question of agreed upon rules, right? Agreed upon standards. So I think we all share, to some extent, this sense of these kind of authoritative definitions that underlie the facts of public life. And it's not entirely untrue, right? Public facts do sometimes seem to be clear and indisputable, especially when you don't look too closely. But what's fascinating is how slippery institutional reality actually can be, how much room for disagreement there really is. So take, again, the example of borders, which is one of Searle's favorites. In fact, border disputes happen all of the time, right? Internationally and even between US states. There are many border disputes happening around the world right now. Where borders fall is, in fact, a matter of interpretation and a matter of opinion, which is not to say that it's arbitrary, that any opinion is as good as any other. So what I've got on the screen here is one of the official repositories of institutional facts about US borders from the US Geological Survey. And before they get to the lengthy business of describing, in words, by the way, the contours of every single border, every single state border in the US, there's this lengthy discussion of what they call boundary problems, in which they explain that, sort of by the way, the actual location of the boundary on the ground has frequently been a difficult problem because of lack of knowledge of the physical features of the topography by those who define the course of the boundary, or because of lack of clarity in the description, or because of errors in surveying the prescribed lines. So this slipperiness in institutional reality is something that the fact checkers run up against all of the time. I think it's one of the reasons that their work is so often controversial. Institutional reality is messy, and facts, even about things like taxes or unemployment or the federal budget, can be surprisingly difficult to pin down when there are different standards in play. So during the time that I spent with professional fact checkers in the 2012 race, the most heated dispute that I ever heard happened in a staff meeting held at PolitiFact when editors were getting together to rule on a claim that Mitt Romney had made about unemployment. He offered this sort of odd comparison, saying that there were more people out of work in the United States than were employed in all of Canada. And the sort of odd way that he phrased that left room for real debate about which unemployment measure to use, right? Of course, there are several different official measures of unemployment. And then there are any number of alternatives that economists have cooked up. And these are designed to address questions like how and whether we should count people who are underemployed or only marginally attached to the labor force, or even who've given up looking for work altogether. And there was one editor at PolitiFact who felt very strongly that, that people who've given up looking for work should be counted. And if they were counted, then Romney's claim would be at least half true, right? He'd be pretty close to the mark. But she was overruled by a number of other editors who accused her of being biased, in favor of the unemployed, I guess. So there are many examples where fact checkers are accused by outsiders of using the wrong standard. This is another interesting one that came up during my research, and it relates to a claim that Harry Reid, who was then the majority leader, had made about the number of millionaires who paid no federal taxes. He said there were 7,000 of them in the United States, and that was, profoundly unfair that all of these millionaires should not be paying taxes. And so the fact checker at the Washington Post decided to investigate this, and it sounds like this would be, fairly straightforward. But once again, it depends on which standard you use. So the fact checker called up Reid's office. This is something that fact checkers always do. And a staffer there sent him a report that used the standard of cash income, right? If you're a millionaire according to your cash income. But the fact checker thought that the IRS measure of adjusted gross income was a more appropriate measure given the context of the debate, right? The claim was made in a debate about tax policy. So he gave him 2 Pinocchios for using the wrong standard, essentially. And this really upset one of Reid's staffers, the staffer who he'd called, who then wrote him an email saying, if you consider a true statement for which I can provide a clear citation to merit even a single Pinocchio, then the raison d'etre of your blog is beyond me. Now, of course, there's no worse insult you can hurl at a Washington Post reporter than to call him a blogger. But you can see how sincere this disagreement was. All right, the last example I'll give you demonstrates how the same kinds of problems surface even in debates about scientific facts. So this concerns a really startling and frightening claim that George Will had made in 2014 at the height of the ultimately very small Ebola outbreak in the United States about the possibility of airborne transmission of the virus.
The original assumption was, said with great certitude, if not certainty, was that you need to have direct contact, meaning with bodily fluids from someone, because it's not airborne. There are now doctors who are saying, we're not so sure that it can't be, in some senses, transmitted by airborne.
So that's a scary claim, and PolitiFact decided to investigate it. And it turned out that George Will was correct, that there was, in fact, a lab experiment that suggested that transmission could occur through the air, but not under circumstances that count as airborne to epidemiologists or to virologists. One of the scientists who they interviewed explained this is still a form of direct contact, even though it's traveling through the air, right? It turns out that for scientists, the category airborne, this is a chart which they ran in a follow-up to this fact check. It turns out that for scientists, the category airborne entails, a set of judgments about a cluster of characteristics that speak to the ease of transmission of a virus in an assumed context of human behavior. So they ask questions like whether the virus itself promotes sneezing, which Ebola doesn't. They ask how sick you have to be for the virus to be transmitted in this way. In Ebola's case, you have to be extremely sick, probably so sick that you're not out riding the subway, but instead you're bedridden. And they also ask how long the disease-carrying particles remain suspended in the air. And again, as this chart illustrates, in Ebola's case, it's not very long. So once again, we have a situation where Will's claim was accurate by one literal standard, but not by what fact checkers or the relevant professional community saw as the relevant standard. So that's sort of an awkward place to end. So I think as a final point, I'll just emphasize that although fact-checking doesn't seem to live up to our most sort of naive hopes for what it can accomplish in terms of, kind of cleaning up public discourse, anchoring debates more firmly on a bed of facts, it does get as close as we know how, right? It's always been true that we are less rational and the world is more complicated than we usually like to admit or to think. Journalists accept that every day in the work that they do, not just in fact checks, but in covering a school board meeting, in performing some investigation that they know may not yield the kind of public debate that they hope for, that one would rationally hope for. Walter Lippmann famously raised these concerns in his 1922 book, Public Opinion. Lippmann was not very hopeful in the end about the sort of democratic public and its ability to reach, broadly speaking, rational conclusions about the important questions facing the United States. And he was even less hopeful about journalists' ability to supply the information that such a public would need. But I think that it's indisputable that journalism is much better today than it was when Lippmann wrote that book. In many senses, journalism has responded to the challenges that he raised. It's more thoughtful today, it's more penetrating, more analytical, less credulous, less believing of official claims. And fact-checking is a part of this much longer sort of 5-decade shift towards this more analytical journalism. And I think that undoubtedly we're better off with fact-checking than without it. So that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your insights. Given the work that you've been doing and the reading and the study and looking at this situation for obviously a lot longer than most of the rest of us, if you were given a continuum and just you had to locate yourself somewhere along a line, and at one far end is human beings are fundamentally rational, logical, Euclidean, thinking, reasoning, reflective, logical, rational creatures, and the other end,
hard question.
And the other end, driven by beliefs, passions, prejudices, points of view. Where are you at the moment, given everything you've read, seen, and learned? Are you in the middle? Are you closer to one end or the other?
I mean, I think it's impressive that in certain circumstances, we can, in fact, collectively display something like rational analysis and intelligent response to public challenges. So, while we're somewhere in the middle on the spectrum that you describe, there are clearly instances in which we sort of rise to the challenge.
So I'm going to push you a little bit just because I'm trying to find out where you are.
That was kind of a dodgy question.
Yeah, I'm trying to find out where, your own, given everything you've seen, read, studied, and so on, you're looking at the human animal. Do you lean towards the human animal is more down here logical, rational, or more down here driven by beliefs, prejudices, and not so rational, logical after all? Where are you in your own perspective looking at the creature?
I think we're a lot more rational than the other animals.
No. I'm looking for just. Can you give a straight answer?
Okay,
to that
60%.
60%. Which way?
Of the way.
Which way do we lean? Rational or
rational?
We do.
Yeah.
From what you've seen.
60%.
So we're more rational than irrational.
We're a little more rational than irrational.
But not much.
In our best moments.
Thank you.
That's a really difficult question. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks very much. I had a question. In your studies, have you put any have you discovered any data that would suggest that the increase of lies is tied anyway to any increase in lack of education or in illiteracy or literacy rates in the United States? So is literacy tied to a lack of either accepting or understanding fact from non-fact?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure that there actually has been an increase in lies, right? Or exactly how we would measure that. It's definitely the case that if you look back at American politics in the 19th century, for instance, you see just rampant lying, really vicious false claims being made about, for instance, President Lincoln. I think what is true is that there was a sort of brief lull in the middle of the 20th century when we had a largely consensus-driven politics, and that's because of, it's because in part because of the Cold War, and also because we had this basic agreement that we were, an industrial welfare state. And after that consensus began to fracture politically, and also with the fragmentation of the media, we have less consensus-driven politics. And I think when you're living in the middle of less consensus-driven politics, what that looks like is, is more lying, right? More sort of wild claims circulating. At the same time, our political discourse is much more open, right, than it was in the middle of the last century. There are many more people involved in public debate. It's easier to challenge the claims that elites make. Journalists are much more critical, as I was saying. So the kind of irony is that what goes along with a more critical public discourse is what looks like, less stable truth, right? Much more arguing, if that makes sense.
I'm curious if you've taken a look at any countries that have more than like two major political parties, and if they are more likely to believe fact-checking as true. Can you speak to that at all?
I can't speak to whether they're more likely to believe fact-checking is true, but I have interviewed a lot of fact-checkers in different countries. This summer, I spent a lot of time traveling around Europe. It was a hard assignment, talking to fact-checkers, including many in Eastern Europe and many in parliamentary democracies. And there was one outfit in the Czech Republic which checks every single claim that's made in these weekly televised debates. So instead of just picking claims that sound interesting like American fact checkers do, they try to check every single thing that's said, including obvious things like what the politician's name is or what day it is, et cetera. And because they take that approach, they can sort of measure the, what they call the degree of lying in each debate. And their data suggests that since they started monitoring these debates in 2010, there's been less lying, at least in these debates, right? These weekly televised debates. That doesn't speak to your question of whether people believe the fact checkers, but it does suggest maybe in particular kinds of institutional circumstances, fact checking can have a direct impact.
I have three things that I consider facts. President Obama was born in the United States. The average global temperature has gone up in the last 10 years. Smoking causes heart disease. To me, these are like just facts, but they've become political. And I don't see why some of this stuff is political. Why is observing global temperatures and reporting that what is happening, it's become political. And it always seems to be tied to one of the political parties, not the other. At least these three that I'm mentioning. And I'm wondering if the way that the Republican Party has disassociated itself from basic facts, that if that's contributed to the rise of somebody like Donald Trump, who seems more untethered to facts than the other candidate.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. I think that the data that the fact checkers collect and have collected over the last decade, especially the ones that rate claims like PolitiFact, and they keep all of those verdicts in a database. The data they've collected shows consistently that on average, Republican candidates earn lower ratings than Democratic ones. Now, the fact checkers themselves never tally up this data because they don't want to be accused of bias, but it's really easy for outsiders to look at their database and do the calculations. And that's happened a number of times over the last 5 years. And there was one study by a conservative political scientist that found that Republicans rated by PolitiFact received the worst 2 ratings, false and pants on fire, more than 3 times as often as Democrats received those 2 worst ratings. Now, people who do these studies usually say that that's evidence that PolitiFact is biased or that it's selecting claims in some unfair way. The fact checkers usually don't say anything, they don't want to respond or get involved in it. But obviously the other interpretation is that there's something consistently different, at least right now, about political discourse on the left and on the right. And I certainly think that that's true, and I don't know how to explain it. We'll take 2 more questions, I guess.
I got 2 questions, though. So who pays for these fact checks services? And then the other question is, does the journalism change when they start to do the fact checking as they write the stories? What I'm thinking of is a couple of months ago, the New York Times just started to say Trump has lied about Obama's birth, or I think that's what it was about. And they just started the articles from the get-go saying that he's a liar instead of after the fact.
Yeah, those are great questions. So they're funded in many different ways. Some of them are attached to news organizations. So they depend on advertising revenue or subscription revenue in the same way that, that everything else that media outlet does. But others of them are attached to nonprofits. So factcheck.org is a nonprofit. And even though it's staffed by professional journalists, it lives at the University of Pennsylvania, and it gets almost all of its money from the Annenberg Foundation. And there are some that have run sort of crowdfunding campaigns. They rely on public contributions. Basically, the entire range of business models you see, for the media in general applies as well to fact checkers, although with a greater emphasis on NGO backing. Especially outside of the United States, where you have a lot of NGO-driven fact checkers. And what was the second question again? Right. No, I think the biggest sort of development we've seen during this election cycle in terms of fact checking is this increased willingness on the part of news outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post, even some broadcasters, CNN with its crawl, to kind of insert fact checks into straight news reporting. And that does change the tenor of those reports. And I think, I think it's a very sort of salutary development, but that at the same time, it's clearly going to sort of subject the reporters, now in their straight reporting, not just in their fact checks, to accusations of bias, and it may perversely have the effect of further eroding the already quite low levels of trust in the media. I hope that's not the case. I mean, some people obviously respond by putting greater faith in the media. It's not clear which of those impulses will win out. Is that it, or was there one more? All right, last question.
This is more commenty than questioning, but the New Yorker picture of Obama and Michelle with a
fist bump.
The fist bump, burning the American flag, the assault weapons, the Muslim dress. And probably most New Yorker cartoons saw that as an ironic cover saying this is the crap these guys have to put up with. I read a commentary that I'm assuming was intended to be true about this is the kind of crap that Obama and Michelle have to put up with, that the press is portraying them as Muslim extremists, as opposed to the ironic interpretation, which is this is a ridiculous portrayal of them as a Muslim extremist. One was to denigrate Obama, and the other was to basically say, poor guy.
I mean, I'm with you. I think the New Yorker clearly had its tongue firmly implanted in its cheek when they ran that cover. But it was a response to the other crap that they clearly have to put up with, that the Obamas have put up with.
But no, the interpretation was that it was intended to make them look bad, as opposed to make them look like victims.
Yeah, that's the trouble with interpretation. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much to Professor Graves, and I'm guessing you can stick around for a couple more minutes.
Sure, I'm happy to.
Okay, thanks so much, and we'll see you back here in December. Go vote.
Go vote.